Hi everyone, and welcome back. We're joined again by Colonel Wilkerson, who spent decades in military service since the 1960s before going into government in the 2000s as the Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Thank you for taking the time.
Good to be with you, Glenn.
So, in my opinion, one of the great problems in the West these days is the inability to assess the security concerns of our opponents, be it Russia, China, Iran, or any others, as we no longer do what's the most fundamental thing when you try to reduce the security competition is we don't discuss the security interest of our opponents because all our conflicts must be presented as a struggle between good and evil. So if you can't assess the security concern of your opponents, it's very difficult to mitigate the security competition. And in other words, all paths to peace must be through victory. So today I really want to discuss the what's considered to be the main historical concern, the historical security concern of Russia, which is the encirclement of Russia, which has been quite an enduring concern for the Russians if you look through its history. And NATO expansionism is really the manifestation of this encirclement from the Russian perspective. I was wondering if you can speak to this, how you see this Russian concern and why they're so worried about being encircled.
I always start with the backdrop, and the backdrop, I think, is becoming clearer every day that goes by. The backdrop is the great game with new players. And what I mean by that is power is moving inexorably toward the east and away from the west. All you have to do is look at population count to understand why that's happening in many respects. 1 in 5 people in the world is Chinese, 2 in 5 is Indian or Chinese, 3 in 5 is Asian. That leaves only 2 in 5 for us. Power is shifting very rapidly, a lot more rapidly than it did the other way for roughly 2,000 years. And the empire, badly led by a three-ring circus with Trump in the center and Hegseth on the left and Rubio on the right, if you will, and the billionaires behind them, is just absolutely ignorant of this fact, other than the billionaires, the oligarchs, being very concerned about the empire's ability to continue to rape, pillage, and plunder the world in their behalf. And I don't say that loosely at all, because that's really what capitalism has become in the hands of states like Israel and like the United States. And to a certain extent, 1 or 2 European countries, it's become predatory. In the sense that Marx, for example, I think it was Marx, said that give them enough rope and they'll hang themselves. There was a lot of truth to that. You go to monopoly, cheap products, very expensive products that are cheap in terms of the way they're built, and that's just a small microcosm of what predatory capitalism is all about. But that's what we are today, a predatory capitalist state. That kind of state sees everyone as an opponent. I loved your use of that term opponent, because we don't see people out there. Like, for example, H.W. Bush did when I was serving in that administration as special assistant to Colin Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We call people strategic competitors if they were, in fact, economically and trade-wise our competitors, and at times would threaten us in that regard. We call them strategic competitors. We didn't call them opponents. I don't think I ever heard Colin Powell use that term when he was Secretary of State or chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I certainly heard Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld use that expression repeatedly, and even Condi Rice, the National Security Advisor. So that's what's taken over. They have this incoherent, they can't even explain it. Certainly Trump can't. Fear of what's happening, and it's happening in spades with regard to China. And what they've done is set up this, what I call an arc of crisis that extends now from the Arctic, where China is trying very frontally trying to become a member of the Arctic community, if you will, with Russia helping her now because we've forced them together. And that arc of crisis goes all the way down through the Baltic now, General Donahue having pronounced it so, all the way down through the proxy war in Ukraine and into Georgia, where we tried to overthrow the government. They're still trying to overthrow it again because we failed the first time around. They didn't stay very long. We're trying to get the government out right now because that government wants a balanced foreign policy, not too close to Moscow, not too close to NATO, all the way down through Azerbaijan and into Iraq, or into Iran rather, and Syria, and on down to the Persian Gulf. All of this arc of crisis, this geopolitical line we've drawn in the sand, if you will, incoherently so with this clown we have as president, is designed to arrest the base road initiatives that are now very prominently in the center, where Ukraine is the stopgap, if you will. Down south with Iran, where Iran and the war that Bibi Netanyahu contemplates there is the stopgap, Syria being a help too, all the way up to the Baltic, where Donahue just pronounced the U.S.'s ability to challenge the Russians in Kaliningrad, all the way up to the Arctic, where we are plotting right now with the Norwegians and the Finns and others, the northern flank of NATO, if you will, to challenge Russia and China in the Arctic. I remember vividly a moment in Admiral Crowell's life when I worked for Admiral Crowell when he was in the Pacific, and then what we call the PACOM commander, the Pacific Command commander, and moved up to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and had a meeting with then his counterpart in then the Soviet Union, Marshal Akhmayev. And one of the first things Akhmayev did was hand Crowell, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for us, a map. I have a copy of it. That map essentially told Crowell how Akhmayev looked at the encirclement of the Soviet Union. It showed every military base, every installation, Allied and primary U.S., that was arrayed around the Soviet Union. And his point was simply, and you think that we could come to some modus operandi? Because that was kind of Crowell's approach to it. You got to, quit encircling us this way if you think we can come to some kind of, and look how sensitive you are when we put missiles in Cuba. You've got them everywhere around us. Well, that's kind of the way we're doing today to both Russia and China. I mentioned before we went on air, General Dennis Leitch, myself, and General Margaret Wilmot, I won't mention the name, met with a senator recently, a Democrat, I'll at least say that. And our ostensible purpose was to talk about the all-volunteer force and how broken it is. Broken in all of its components, both reserve and active. And one of the things she countered with was the tour she had just taken of the Pacific theater throughout the South China Sea, to the Philippines, to Korea, to Japan, to Taiwan and such. And she clearly, and we were all of us were looking at each other, we knew what was happening. The military had what we call in the military blown smoke up her rear end throughout the whole trip. She talked about how we had China encircled. We had allies all around. We had people who were going to take care of China if anything were to result adversely in the South China Sea, with Taiwan or wherever it might be. And we did our best to disabuse her of this knowledge the Pentagon had imparted to her. Because the truth is that if we went to war in the South China Sea, the Chinese would lick our ass very fast. No matter what the circumstances were, they would lick us because they have a much bigger, more robust industrial base. They can build hundreds of ships to our 2 or 3. They have enormous forces marshaled in the key places. And it doesn't matter if you have them surrounded with all these countries like the Philippines and Australia, and the exercise we're getting ready to do right now, I think, the big Pacific exercise, includes such giants as Papua New Guinea. I could even say that about Australia. Certainly some of the countries that are involved in it. And we've got different governments in Korea and different governments in Japan now. And it's looking somewhat dicey about their allegiance to the empire in the long term. So what we tried to do with that senator was disabuse her of this myth that she'd been told by the military. And I'm not sure we succeeded. She promised us a future hearing, and nothing has ever been done. She's not followed up on it. So the Congress of the United States still is believing what the Pentagon is telling them. The reality is that this four-pronged, if you will, approach by China into the Arctic, into the central part of Europe, certainly into the Levant, and I think there's another approach too that's developing in the middle, north of the Baltic and between the Arctic. These approaches are the most powerful economic power in the world. That's what we're talking about, and we have compelled them also through our eras, mainly the war in Ukraine, to ally themselves with Russia and Russia with them. So we have done something Mackinder would absolutely fall over himself about. We have, and Kissinger and all the people who, Brent Scowcroft, whom I consider being modern good strategists, they would be apoplectic about this. We forced Russia and China together, tighter, linked every day. And so we have created a situation, and I'll just end on this very, very sour and sad note, where the empire, when it realizes how badly it is losing conventionally, will go to its nuclear weapons. And that frightens me because I know we'll do it. I know we'll do it. Been there, been in the discussions. I know we'll do it. We were the first to use nuclear weapons to kill other human beings. We'll be the last to use nuclear weapons to kill other human beings. And that frightens me. It truly frightens me that we are going to be the country that starts the nuclear holocaust.
That's a grim thought. I wanted to ask you though, because it is very difficult in to recognize this encirclement strategies, but this makes it very difficult to understand what
Who's encircling whom?
well, the competitor, what they're doing. So for example, with the Chinese, what they're doing in the South China Sea, if you take the context away, that is the US island chains, the two island chains which were developed since the 1950s to contain and encircle China, if you leave that out of the equation, then what China's doing in the South China Sea seems like unprovoked aggression, a little bit like the unprovoked aggression by Russia. But then what is fascinating with Russia is that this was common sense for centuries. That is, Nicholas Spikeman, he wrote back in 1942, the American scholar on containment of Russia. He wrote that ever since Peter the Great, Russia has always attempted to break through this encirclement, and going through the sea was a key approach. And so then, as you argued, the main seas it had to go through was the Arctic, and of course the Baltic Sea, which Peter the Great opened, and the Black Sea. And those are always the areas where we now seemingly are looking to confront the Russians, as you mentioned, those three. But even in the 90s, when we decided to expand NATO, you had former US officials writing letters that this convinced Russia that they were being encircled. Um, Yeltsin, he warned this is a new encirclement. In 2008, you had the CIA director Burns writing this letter that if we continue to try to pull Ukraine into the NATO orbit, he wrote that Russia perceive encirclement, and this is why they would use force to prevent it. I mean, this was common sense. So how could we end up in this situation where the encirclement of Russia is shrugged off as if it's some conspiracy theory or Russian propaganda? It's this should really be front and center if we talk about security and reducing conflict with Russia. This should be our first thing to discuss, shouldn't it?
Absolutely. And we should discuss it as one great power going down to another great power somewhere in the middle, allied with a great power going up. And we should realize that as we go into the discussion. That's my major point to all the senators and congressmen and others with whom I discuss this, if they will listen. We are so badly in debt right now and so badly encumbered with the predatory capitalist system that we have created that the only way we're going to survive is a national entity. And increasingly, Trump is making that even suspect with his domestic operations, is if we recognize the peril we're in and do something about it, something really smart about it. And the first part of that smartness, that cleverness, that geostrategic grasp, if you will, would be to recognize the situation for what it is and then to accommodate it. We are not going to be the world hegemon in any respect. In fact, we're going to be quite a layer or two beneath that in terms of the way the world is developing. So accept that and then build out the kind of consortium that we need to have that will deal with such existential challenges to all of us as nuclear weapons with no treaties at all and the climate crisis. We have a man in our White House who utterly denies repeatedly that there's a climate crisis. And if you look at his actions, which I'm watching very closely because I'm a member of the Climate Security Working Group, been there for 11, 12 years. If you look at his actions, he is disassembling most of the things, if not ultimately intending to disassemble them all, that we have put together to bring some kind of coherence and sanity to the way we approach this very dangerous situation, which I here in Virginia right now are experiencing. We're going to have a 106-degree heat factor today. People out west are telling me about the heat they have out there, and I say, well, let me tell you about the heat we have right here in the east. This is becoming a situation that the whole world, but certainly the more powerful entities in that world are going to have to deal with. And they're going to have to deal with it without the nonsense that we've seen so far. I mean, substantive action to get some sort of reduction in the rise of temperature and in what is inevitably going to be a sea rise factor that we're going to have to deal with in ways, and we've just had some new briefings on this, in ways that we're not contemplated and we weren't thinking about. I'm talking about really significant sea rise. And the other things that go along with all this, like these torrential rainfalls that we're having, these much worse hurricanes that we're having, and so forth. And as I said, the fact we are treatyless. We have no treaties left for nuclear weapons. START is a figment of our imagination, really. It goes out in February 26th, and I don't think Putin will have any desire whatsoever dealing with duplicitous Washington and the circus clown we have in charge. I don't think he'll be willing to go to the table and sit down and talk about it. So I actually think that Xi Jinping and Putin have calculated that the empire is not dealable with. It is not manageable, that they are going to have to prepare for the empire's collapse and the things that a collapsing empire sometimes does when it gets into those kinds of straits. I don't think they believe that they can rescue us, if you will. I don't think they believe that they can come up with a diplomatic approach, ASEAN-like, if you will, which is what Xi Jinping wants to do, I think, based on trade, based on economics, based on commerce, based on the kinds of things that throughout history have made a difference when big, huge power shifts like this one took place. They don't think that's going to work. So I think probably now they're deciding to batten down the hatches. One of the things Xi Jinping has decided that I think is anathema, but I don't discount the reasons for him doing it, is to build out his own nuclear weapons complex. And I'm hearing now from people associated with the Strategic Party School, the Central Party School and their strategic entity, that they're thinking they need to build out to the point where they can match the Soviets, the Russians today. The Russians, 6,000 some odd warheads, and the United States is 5,900 or so warheads combined. That's a hell of a nuclear build out if that's true. But even if he's only going to build out to equal Russia or to equal us, that's still a very dangerous build out. And that's a decision that apparently they've made and they are already executing. This is going to be an extremely more dangerous world with no treaties and all these new programs, including our own $2 trillion plus program, which is aimed at, incidentally, this program is aimed in part at creating the capability to strike first, ride out whatever comes back, and survive. This is actually being talked about at U.S. Strategic Command. It's actually being talked about in the Pentagon, that we could develop technologically the capability that our first strike would be so devastating, particularly to land-based missiles and such, that we could expect to win, which is nonsense in my view. But there are serious people actually talking about this now. I think we're in a new world with regard to nuclear weapons. And it's not a very calm, peaceful world. It's a very dangerous world. And it's treatyless, as I said. And we're stirring up all the parties who could correct this. We've got them all antagonized and thinking they were the most deceptive people on earth and not willing to deal with us. I don't blame them a bit, but someone's got to have some sanity here, and we've got to do something about this out of control, really burgeoning nuclear arms race that we are fueling and the Chinese are fueling and possibly others will too. And let me just footnote that and say, there's no question in my mind that the attack on Iran was unsuccessful. Unsuccessful. They had either moved key ingredients of their nuclear program elsewhere, or those that remained at Fordo Isfahan or any other place were not damaged to the extent that we and Netanyahu claim. I think we are looking at an Iran that if it makes a decision, and if I were it, speaking strictly as a military professional, if I were Iran, I would make this decision to build a bomb and present it as a fait accompli. Someone said to me the other day, well, we'd know that was happening, or Mossad would know that was happening. I said, no, we wouldn't. When Jim Kelly went to Pyongyang to talk to Yi Gun and Kang Sok-ju, then dead now, but then the principal negotiators for Kim Jong-il at that time on their nuclear program, he was shocked when they looked at him and said, we already have nuclear weapons. Oh, we already have nuclear weapons. Did you hear me? Translate that again, please. Well, we knew that they were very close, but I don't think we thought we would get that affirmation straight from the mouth of the two nuclear negotiators. We got it. We also were told by the center in Geneva, I believe it is, the seismic center, that there had been an unusual seismic event in North Korea. Wow, we missed that entirely. Oh, what could that have been? We said to ourselves, and I'm in the working group that was dealing with this. What could that have been? We did a little examination and we saw that the seismic event, as reported by Geneva, was in a place we knew all about, that we were monitoring, but we missed it. The second one we didn't miss because we were far more alert for that second one. We had all our indicators around, our sniffers in the air and so forth, and we detected the second test. Iran could do the same thing. They were students of the North Koreans during the period that I was at State and we were working on the disassembling the AQ-Khan network. We noted that the North Koreans and the Iranians were working very extensively together on ballistic missile development and also on how to do things deep underground. So imagine what Bibi Netanyahu will do when the Iranians present him with a fait accompli and they have a nuclear weapon. That's what I would do if I were they and I were under the circumstances that Bibi Netanyahu has put them under now. So it's a very dangerous world, and it's even more dangerous and perhaps existentially so for a lot of people because the empire is broken. Broken in terms of its physical state and broken in terms of its ability to think geostrategically, geopolitically in a sound and reasonable way. We simply can't. All we can do is react, and our reactions are basically not diplomatic, not economic, although the tariff deal has got everybody thinking they are. Our reactions are really military power and sanctions, or both. That's how we deal with the world now. That's not going to work. And it's a very dangerous world because of us more than anything else.
It's interesting. I spoke to Professor Ted Postel, who was also an advisor to the Pentagon, and he was coming with the same assessment, that is, that Iran now has such huge amounts of highly enriched uranium that they have enough to build several nuclear weapons. And given that it seems foolish to assume that the US and Israel have now decided not to destroy Iran after all, that it makes sense to develop bombs. So almost, word for word what you said. If he was advising them, he would he would recommend to develop the bomb as well. If I was advising Tehran, I would argue the same. No one's going to stop until you're the next Libya or Syria or Iraq or anyone else. So you really need to develop a nuclear bomb. I hope they don't, from a personal perspective, but if I was advising them based on what their national interests are, I would say this is something you need to develop. But Professor Postel also argued that they would likely go the path of a non-declared nuclear power, be another Israel, if you will, as opposed to go straight into the North Korean scenario. Simply have enough ambiguity, develop their weapons, make sure that the United States and Israel are aware, but don't go the extra length of declaring it. Again, he doesn't have a crystal ball. They might go the North Korean way, or they might not get nuclear weapons at all. But the point being, that they have been pushed towards this, that this is now in their national interest. And again, this is a bit of going back to my point. We're not able to identify national interest unless we discuss security concerns. And much like Russia and China, the Iranians are also very concerned about being encircled. But we don't. I think the reason we don't speak about this is, well, when you talk about encirclement of Russia in Europe, it's in the language of democracy. Well, we're just allowing free people to decide which security arrangements they want. When encircling China, we talk about the freedom of navigation. When you encircle Iran, it's about fighting terror or providing security and freedom. It's just we never we never address why the opponent might feel concerned. Again, my point is, if you don't want the Chinese or Iranians to further develop nuclear weapons, then a good point to start would be to look at the concerns for encirclement. But it doesn't seem like we ever do, though.
You're right. And to your Iran suppositions, and they are just like mine suppositions, but I think they're based on some pretty sound ground. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is a real issue with them, and the IAEA is a real issue. If you build, you're going to be found out by the IAEA or others that are associated with it. I mean, let's face it, the IAEA is infiltrated by the CIA, by Mossad, and by MI6. I was there. I saw how we picked, for example, the Director General of the IAEA. We vetted people that we could essentially, once they were in office, influence strongly. No doubt in my mind, for example, that the IAEA either inadvertently or more likely on purpose, as they came out of Iran before the attacks, gave the Israelis intelligence on where the real critical elements were. Now, the Iranians had fooled them. Thank goodness, in the case of Tehran, they had fooled them, and they didn't get really good information, and we didn't really make a formidable attack on Iran.
How did you? Oh, sorry to interrupt. But how did you? I guess take control over or manipulate the IAEA?
Oh, you just make sure that, first of all, you make sure that one or two of the individuals that are approved for service in the staff or CIA or Mossad or MI6, those three are now almost a single entity. And at various times and in various places, the one will be the leader and the other will be the follower. Although in those kinds of worlds, the clandestine world, you never know who is the leader and who's the follower. But just to give you an example, when Donahue, the absolutely idiotic general, I'm used to airborne generals. He was commander 18th Airborne Corps before he got his other star and went over there. Commands the U.S. Army Europe now, I think they still call it. But when he pronounced that we could take Kaliningrad away from the Russians in public, you know who's working for him and helping him in that regard? Ukrainians. Ukrainian intelligence services who are trying to infiltrate Kaliningrad and, replace some of the people there so they can be better spies. Well, that's what we do. That's what the CIA and Mossad and the MI6 are all over Central Europe. They're all over Lebanon. Why did we build the largest embassy we've ever built in the world in Lebanon? In Lebanon. Why did we do that? Because it's not really an embassy. There'll be some diplomats there, but mainly it's headquarters for CIA, Mossad, and MI6 in the Levant. These entities, in many respects, have weaponized liberal democracy. And that's what the color revolutions, that's what 2014 was all about in Ukraine. That's what it was about in Georgia. That's what happened to Colin Georgescu in Romania. Even though he won the election, he didn't wind up winning the further election, which would have made him the ruler of Romania, because we made sure it didn't happen. Back to your question, we make sure the OPCW, the IAEA, and all such regulatory or oversight bodies have people from our intelligence community on their staffs. We even handpick from time to time the director generals, just as we handpicked Jan Stoltenberg and we handpicked his successor, Mark Rutte, both of whom are brain dead for the empire. And, so pursuing the idea that NATO is all powerful and all present and just can do anything it wants to do, and lately convincing themselves that all the countries are going to go to 5% of their GDP, that's laughable. That's risible. I'm sorry. If you do that, every leader doing that, from Merz to Macron to Starmer, you name them, will be thrown out of office by their own people, because the reason they live today in Europe is for the luxurious social programs they have. And I'm not discounting those programs in any way in a negative sense, because they have healthcare, they have education, they have all the benefits of a decently run liberal democracy. And these leaders are going to be thrown out of office before they rip that fabric up in order to go defensive, in order to be more robust members of NATO. So Europe's going to fall on its own petard there. It's a disaster, and we have created it. We have created it. In my administration, and George W. Bush's administration, we started buying newspapers. We started buying leaders. We started buying all manner of influential entities all across Europe so we could get people elected who would be favorable to ending years of neutrality in the case of some of them, and becoming members of NATO. And then we stirred up Ukraine to put a little icing on the cake by making them afraid of Russia. This is also clear that we've been doing it, that I'm astonished that there aren't more people writing about it, except, most of our media is brain dead too. But this is what we've been doing for years now. Ever since 9/11, in spades, we've been doing this in conjunction with MI6, and now very much so in conjunction with Mossad. So this strategy worked beautifully, but it created chaos. It created what we wanted along that arc of crisis, if you will, because now China is looking at an abrupt stop to each branch of its Base Road Initiative caused by the United States and its allies. The latest one being, of course, the rail flowing into Iran, which was going to revolutionize. We're talking about the rail coming through Central Asia and the rail coming to Iran. We're talking about reducing the time for Pacific port of China produce products by 2.5 days. Not going by sea anymore, but going by 16 hours of rail or 25 hours of rail. That cuts your costs enormously, makes you much more competitive with products coming out of the other end of the world, if you will. And it also expedites all the kinds of things you want to expedite, like staying away from the United States Navy, because all of these routes are across land. And China's smart. It's doing exactly what it wants to do, and we have put this arc of conflict together to abut and stop all of these efforts. It isn't going to work. It isn't going to work because when Germany, for example, wakes up to the fact that it's destitute in terms of its economic wherewithal, it will have to turn to other people like Moscow and Beijing in order to resurrect itself. And it will do that. It will do that in a heartbeat when its people throw out Merz and other people like him and put new leaders in. Now, there's a complicating factor in Germany, and I suspect there'll be complicating factors in other European countries too. You've got the AfD sitting there, and you've got them gaining power every day. And there's an element of the AfD that looks a lot Nazi-like. And so you've got this problem with what we're doing to Europe that could result in a Europe more like the 30s Europe or the 20s Europe, where people are squabbling and fighting all the time and they produce pretty vicious wars. That's a possibility. Tell Ursula von der Leyen, or whatever her name is, about that. And she'll run away to her $35 billion scam with, who is it? That company that she's been associated with, at 35 billion euros, rather. She's trying to hide that right now. But I don't see Europe's future as being very bright right now. And we've made it dim. We have created the dim future in our attempt to reestablish economic and other hegemony over Europe. And we have, I think, failed majorly, and we'll see that failure as the governments now in charge in Europe get changed over the next 12 to 18 months, changed by their people and their democratic processes. Germany's process is really hard because it's not really democratic. Germany's process is just broken. You can become chancellor of Germany by putting together some coalitions that don't even represent 45% of your country. I mean, it's crazy. Some of the other European countries are blessed with that kind of, or cursed with that kind of situation too. And France is cursed with its traditional historical problem. It can't rule itself. Macron has proved that. So we'll just have to see how Europe and the governments there play out. But we've done a lot of damage. We've done an enormous lot of damage, and Brussels has been complicit in that damage. And when I say Brussels, I mean both the EU and the NATO leadership.
You mentioned earlier that a key area of encirclement was the Arctic, where we're moving in now. But when you were serving in the Bush administration,
Let me just
uh,
let
how
me just say let me say one thing there because it's so pertinent. One of the reasons we got Finland and Norway is because they have icebreakers and we don't.
Yeah, well, I was I was getting in that direction. I was wondering, you mentioned during in the White House, you know, you guys spent a lot of time looking at how to flip the right Europeans, who should be elevated, who should be brought, well, not elevated, brought down. And was there any focus on Scandinavia back then, given or was it not too early for focusing on pushing NATO into the Arctic to seek to encircle Russia there as well?
I think the Arctic was a big component of it. We were working at the Arctic Council at that time to get Russia dismissed and not allow China even have observer status. Now, in the administration that I served, actually the George W. Bush administration, we were not in favor of that, but it subsequently rolled out that way. And the Arctic Council now is being more or less used as a tool of the empire to keep people who we don't want to be active in the Arctic out of the council. But it's more formidable than that. And you're absolutely right about our working on the Scandinavian countries in particular for this purpose. The northern flank of NATO seemed to be extremely vulnerable if you really contemplated what Russia was doing on its northern rim. And what Russia was doing, Stalin had put a lot of equipment up there that was, shall we say, military or military oriented. Once the USSR evaporated, that went to hell. Well, I mean, almost overnight, it just went. You don't have to wait long for things in the Arctic to go to hell. Winter takes over really quickly. So that whole northern rim of what was the Soviet Union and turned into Russia was allowed to go to pot, particularly under Yeltsin. One of the things Putin has done is revive that to a fairly well. There are military installations up there now, scientific installations that are clearly being designed to monitor the Northwest Passage, which passes closest to and most formidably from a strategic point of view, Russia, because of its coastline and the way it abuts the Arctic. Canada has a lot of coastline too, but it doesn't have the kind of coastline that Russia has that's so conducive to interdiction, conducive to controlling it. There's even talk that the Russians might charge a tariff for passing along that stretch of water because it's in their economic zone. And they have the military power up there to enforce the implementation of such a tariff. We don't want that to happen. And so we're already up there. And we're up there with the Finns and the Norwegians because now they're, that kind of part of NATO. We're up there because they have icebreakers and we don't. We have one broken one and one that's been in port for about 2 years. I think Trump has put some billions of dollars into this $1 trillion plus defense budget to build some, but it takes a long time to build an icebreaker. And we don't do shipbuilding very well at all anymore. Another point, China does shipbuilding really well. Their defense industrial base dwarfs ours. Russia's now dwarfs ours. They can produce things that are necessary for defense a lot faster and a lot more extensively than we can. And oh, by the way, their products are better than ours, as Ukraine has proven, and as Israel's lack of defense against Iran has proven. So we're in a situation right now where the Arctic is a theater of war, and we are treating it that way. And we're treating it that way because we think China and Russia have bad intentions in the Arctic, rather than working with them to do several things. One, ensure that Arctic is not raped, pillaged, and plundered, which many U.S. mining and oil and gas companies would love to do. And I'm sure Putin has a problem with that in his own country too, but he's got a little bit better handle on it. Two, we're thinking that there might be all manner of rare earth metals and other similar commodities that we need desperately on the Arctic seabed, and we might be right. Scientists are saying that that might be a good projection. And three, we're the enemy of everyone else that wants to do the Arctic in a sort of, amiable, diplomatic, let's do this because it's a benefit to humankind way. We want to have control over it, and we want the United States Navy to be able to manage that control, and the Coast Guard where it can. We're crazy, Glenn. We're crazy, and we don't want anybody else interfering with it.
But how this is what I'm struggling with. Why the Europeans are going along with this? Because for so many years, the Arctic was considered to be this area of positive sum cooperation, even during the Cold War at the height of tensions. We could still work in the Arctic,
Yes,
irrespective of any differences. And also, as there's borders for the Scandinavians there with the Russians, it has also been, it's been an area where we can mitigate some of the tensions and we can actually work together. And so there's a national interest in preserving stability. And so
and protecting the Arctic, protecting it.
when
Huge.
Washington want to make a front line, why it's certainly not in the interest of the countries in the region. How is it possible that all the politicians are going along with this? Because this is just, it's got disaster written all over it.
Wait a
Looks like we're going to become the Ukraine of the North.
Wait a
Future
minute.
problem.
You have heard Lindsey Graham repeatedly on the floor of the Senate, and you think there's some sanity with regard to security? I mean, and Lindsey Graham insane as he is, and some of his remarks just testify to that eloquently, represents a considerable portion of the United States legislature. They feel that way, particularly in the Republican Party, but there are plenty of Democrats too, as Blumenthal has proven with his statements about Ukraine and his hugging Lindsey Graham in Kyiv. There's a real pressure from the legislature of the United States, purblind that it is, on all of these matters because they too know, one, how deeply in debt we are and that they have no clue what to do about it, and two, how much China, and now with Russia, has the lead, and they're scared to death. They are frightened to their boots of what's happening, and they think the only way to respond is with military might and with the kind of juggernaut approach that Donald Trump exercises. I think some of them are falling off that a little bit now because they've seen the mess. Did you ever think Marjorie Taylor Greene would stand up and call in the Congress of the United States what's happening in Gaza genocide? She just did that. God bless her for doing that. A little late, lady, but God bless you for doing it. Most of her compatriots in that body are scared to death, and they think out of that fear, the best reaction is $1 trillion defense budget and surrounding our enemies, which is nonsense. One, we can't surround our enemies. Two, you know what the interest payments now annually on our debt are? Over $1 trillion. Within 7 years, it'll be $2 trillion, according to the Office of the Budget and the Presidency, and according to the Congressional Budget Office. It'll be $2 trillion. There will be no discretionary federal spending in the empire. It'll all go to interest payments on the debt and the Pentagon's budget. They don't know what to do about that to stop it. You look at what they just did. They put another $150 billion on top of Trump's trillion. They don't know what to do, so they just keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect that they'll go away into the horizon and take their lobby job or whatever with them. We're insane, Glenn. I can't think of a better term to explain it, but if you look back across the history of empire over the last 5,000 years, you'll find some people who did similar things. You know, whether you're looking at the Eastern or Western Roman Empire, or you're looking at the Persian Empire, you're looking at the Mongol or the Mughal or any of those empires, or the more modern ones, they all aren't here anymore. And at the end, they were pretty stupid.
Yeah, no, it's very frustrating to watch because at the end of the day, I think even key adversaries of the United States now, which are Russia, China, and they wouldn't benefit either from having the United States run into a wall. I think having the U.S. Step down to a more modest position in the international system would probably be quite beneficial. Indeed, China, many still would like to see the dollar being kept
Yes.
for a while. It has great advantages. So
Yes.
so everything isn't that zero sum as we often imagine it to be. But it kind of takes me to my last question. That is, given that we seem to be reaching the end of the line here, as you mentioned, with the debt going out of control, there's panic as the encirclement containment policies are failing. We're pushing all these Eurasian giants together. Well, being given that China and Russia are the two main ones who are now, indirectly opposing or resisting this pressure, how are they responding to this? That is, both the threat of, not just threat, the use of military force against them, but also the weaponization of the international economic system. How do you see them responding to this unique point in history?
I think you have a really good litmus test of an answer to that question coming from, of all places, Brasilia and Lula, because he has made, I've always had a lot of respect for him. He was a real helpmate when I was working on tract 3 diplomacy, track 2 diplomacy, I guess, but we called it track 3 because it was so distant from Western Hemisphere affairs in state for Cuba. We met in Toronto, we met in Havana, many times in Havana, we met in Sao Paulo, we met in Mexico City. And Lula and his foreign policy advisor, who once addressed me this way, "I'm a Marxist. Can you deal with me?" I said, "You're pretty smart too, from what I hear. Of course I could deal with you. My Cuban friends here are mostly Marxists." But I was very impressed with the way he understood the problems and tried to help us. And of course, we got to the point with President Obama where we had a rapprochement occurring between Havana and Washington. Along came Trump and just crushed that. But all to say that Lula's a very smart guy, and I think he's given up. He's given up on the United States of America, and he's going elsewhere, and he's going to do what's necessary to go elsewhere. They could learn from him. These other powers that you're talking about, they could learn from him. Xi Jinping impresses me as a person who watches other things in the world very closely too, and certainly Putin is. And BRICS itself might not be the ultimate answer, but certainly a condominium, if you will, a concert of powers in the world who accept the fact, for example, that the dollar needs to be replaced, that it's going to have to be replaced, that maybe China's going to have to take on the burden. And they don't want to, as you said, of being the world's banker, of being the creator of the transactional mechanism or whatever it is that replaces SWIFT or whatever. I don't think they want that either, but it might be incumbent upon them that they do that, or some consortium of nations does that. Because let's face it, I think Lula's right. Betting on the United States for your future is a desperate game, and you've got to find other things to do. And until the empire wakes up, if it should wake up eventually, and get good leadership is the first prerequisite for that, they've got to fashion their own route in the world. And that it's happening in a place where our predatory capitalism has virtually tried to destroy whole governments, whether Chile or Bolivia or wherever, is really, really fascinating. And that it's happening with a leader in Brasilia is even more fascinating. But I think we're going to see more and more people, more and more leaders in the world doing this sort of thing. And what's going to happen is we're just going to be left in the wake of the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is 4/5 of humanity. So it's not going to be a very tumultuous wake, really, except that we might try to stop it with the use of nuclear weapons. I hope not. I certainly hope not, because that'd be a hell of a way to go.
Yeah, well, Trump just tweeted out, this is how foreign policy is done now, apparently. A threat, not just a threat, but a punishment of India. That is given. He wrote that given that India buys weaponry from Russia, and given that they buy energy from Russia, they will now have to pay 25% tariff. Because this is a bad thing to do, because Russia is at war with Ukraine. To stop the killing, they should put a boycott on Russia. I mean, sounds almost word for word like Biden, except he didn't go to this extent to threaten, to punish India, an actual friendly country. Now, even if India would, bend the knee and do as they're told, like a good European, to subordinate itself like a loyal vassal, well, it wouldn't be the end of it. Then tomorrow, Trump would go and say, now you have to disconnect from China. And then with every time they think they're going to buy some goodwill, they would only become more and more dependent, have fewer cards to play. And at the end, they would have to, again, like us in Europe, embrace the glory of being a vassals and learn to love to lick the boot, which kicks you. So I think
Well, you just put your finger on a subcontinent problem that plays into the bigger problem of the great game having resumed. And that problem is Pakistan, India, and China. Clearly the dominant power there is China, but India in population is overtaking China, if they haven't already, total population. And India is looking more and more like it might be, if it gets really good leadership, and Modi's not that leadership, a very dynamic economic power too. It has the potential to be. So that's a fly in the ointment, if you will, of this Asian coherence, this Eastern coherence that's building this juggernaut to take on the old empire, the American empire. But I think that'll get worked out. It has some real wrinkles that are potentially there, though. For example, I think Pakistan, were Israel to use a nuclear weapon against Iran, Pakistan would eliminate Israel. I do think that. I believe they would do that. In Islamabad, they would make the decision. Israel would be gone. There'd be 5 mushroom clouds. That's all it would take. And Israel would be destroyed. That's how serious the Pacs are with regard to what's happening in the Levant. By the same token, China has to worry about Pakistan doing something like that, or worse, doing something like that to Western India, like what they're doing right now with regard to the glacier melt. You know, they have a terrible problem that's developing, and Western India has a terrible problem that's developing, because when those glaciers are done melting and all the flooding, like the tragic flooding that flooded a third of Pakistan recently, is over. And the problem is the opposite. There's no water coming down. Pakistan has built a series of dams to trap that water and keep it out of Western India, use it themselves, because that's the only way they're going to survive water-wise. Imagine the problems that are there. So you've got this massive little problem, if you will, not so little, in the subcontinent. At the same time, you've got this massive change in where the empire is and where the empire is building. I don't know how that's going to work out, but it's another ingredient of terrible danger that we're confronting, and that bad leadership in Washington just exacerbates, because Trump hasn't a clue to what I was just talking about.
Yeah. Well, going back to my first point, I think if we're at least discussing these issues of what these countries are concerned about, at least there would be some avenue to address these problems, and at least start to prepare for it and look for solutions. For me, one of the great curses of this unipolar moment has been that everything had to be legitimized as, everything being a common good, or so everything had to be framed as a victory of freedom over authoritarianism. So this is why we can't discuss any competing security concerns anymore. Nothing. It's very Manichaean. But
Yeah.
anyway, so thank you so much, Colonel, for your time. I know you're busy, so thanks again.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.